Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young, and as I mentioned to a few people, I'm going to be doing a series of recordings on different policies as part of the election build-up to the October date for the federal election. And one of the areas I'm going to focus on is a lot of it's going to be economic policies with key things that are going to kind of drive the economy. Part of the reason why I'm doing that is my background, just to give you an introduction to who I am. I'm a CPA, CGA by trade, with the bulk of my experience being as I've worked in multinationals for the better part of almost 25 years. But anything to do with tax or economics or exports or anything that supports business expansion and growth are areas that are close and dear to my heart. So I will always question any government that comes to power in terms of the way they operate, whether it's red tape regulations, whether it's tax policies, whether it's options in terms of exports and investment opportunities that help expand a business ability to go beyond its border, are going to be close and dear to my heart. So this particular presentation that I'm going to walk you through is basically going to talk about focus on small business. And the reason why I'm focusing on small business, because this is an area where the NDP seems to try to, along with the Liberal Party, tried to exploit the Conservative Party, basically saying they're doing nothing to create jobs or support small business as part of the overall economic policies as part of strengthening the economy. Now this particular screen it's basically telling you what a small business is. Now a lot of cases companies look at it different ways. Some of them look at it in terms of the number of employees, some will look at revenue and volume. I'm going to basically focus on that typically a small business is about 1 to 100 employees, and usually it's annual sales between 5 to 20 million. Anything above that, usually between about 21 to about 50, is usually deemed medium, and anything above 50 million is usually typically large size companies in terms of their focus, right, in terms of the way we look at things. But again, segmentation by companies can vary by how people look at things in perspective, but in the government's view, typically that's kind of how they look at things, is basically looking at number of employees, but also you should be looking at revenue side as well, which should trigger the same thing. Now the data here is because the data here is basically a little bit dated because they don't always basically update the number of small businesses. So this is a little bit older in terms of certain things, but it puts things in perspective. That basically small business itself, or typically 100,000 new businesses can be created each year on average. So when you start to look at the number of businesses and small businesses, that can be 1 to 5 employees, and you start small, or you can end up being eventually up to 20 employees. So the key is small business is typically a driver of the economy. Now what you need to put things in perspective is it's a little bit misnomer in terms of the value of GDP. Like overall, in Canada's case, the GDP is typically about $2 trillion is what Canada's GDP is. It's estimated that 30% of GDP is typically small business. So that's about 600 billion of GDP is small business. Now, for small business to exist, typically the segments that they are in are typically the service sector. They're usually like plumbing, electrical companies, there's food services, small retailers, repair shops and all that. That's typically where you see small businesses. Now it doesn't mean that you don't see a small driller or a small junior mining company, but typically those companies aren't very typically that as small businesses in terms of the resource sector, because it takes a lot more capital in terms of the requirements to set up a business there. So smaller business typically don't need that much startup capital, so that's why you typically see them focus more on the service sector, retail, warehousing, restaurant area as part of the focus of it. The other thing too that you're going to see too as well is that basically you're going to hear the term too is new jobs created. About 43% of those jobs are in small business. Now again, small business is going to exist to support the overall economic strategy, right? And we know that if 30% of the GDP is small business, that means 70% of the GDP is into other areas, from government spending to resource management to construction to utilities, and we know that that's a big piece of that puzzle, manufacturing, right? So the key aspect here is that small business has a critical path, but it also exists usually to support the grander scheme of the economy. Now when we talk about issues to small business, we're going to talk about 4 key things. We're going to talk about access to capital, access to skilled workers, taxation, red tape, and input costs. Let's talk about access to capital. Like with large companies, you typically have the ability to generate cash better internally through better management of your accounts receivable, extending your payables, as well as any sort of share issue or bank financing. You have that ability to leverage capital, venture capital. When you get to small businesses, they tend to be a lot more risky, and the access to getting capital to start is a little bit more limited. Okay, so that's one of the pain points for a small business is I need the capital to expand, but I can't get the proper capital. Access to skilled workers. Again, you don't have a limited budget where you can go and train people, so you need to be able to leverage apprenticeship programs or other programs within the government to support your ability to attract skilled workers that help you grow your business. Taxation. Now, taxation has multitude of facets to it. Property taxes, so if you rent or basically own a building, you're going to be paying property tax. Payroll taxes, that's your CPP, EI. Income tax. Now the big thing with CPP and EI, it's your matching piece that you're going to have to pay in terms of one for one or $1 for dollar, or in terms of unemployment, it's about 1.4 of each dollar you're going to spend. You're going to pay 40% more of that. So you're going to hear about that as well. Corporate taxation. Well, small business right now is taxed at like about 11%. The federal government is looking at taxation in terms of bringing that down to 9% over the next few years. Red tape, well, that's everything from filing CRA forms, filing workman's comps forms, all that government regulation that you have to do to kind of keep your business going in terms of how much time are you spending on doing that, your paperwork, right? Input costs, now this is stuff where you get into your raw materials, whether that's food processing costs, whether that's auto parts, whether that's electrical equipment, whether that's plumbing equipment, whether that's raw material like steel, nickel, iron ore it's required to make your prefabricated stuff. That's all part of that. Purchase goods, if I'm a retailer, I'm bringing that stuff in, so I have to deal with excise tax duties as part of bringing products in across the border, and we're seeing a big bloom with e-commerce companies. A lot of people are working from home or setting up things through Kijiji and all that to basically move inventory around. Rent, do I have to rent a facility? Do I own something? Hydro, what's my hydro cost to basically keep my building operational? And that could be gas costs, heating costs, electrical. Labor, what's my labor rates? And typically we'll see it in the next slide that the small business tend to pay less than medium to large size business because of they have to watch their cost, and other overhead, and that comes into play as well. So let's talk about the last budget that was released by Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper put a big focus on a multitude of things to support small business. One is he's bringing in an EI cut in 2017 to basically target it at startups. It's almost like the 1 to 10 employees, that this initial startup companies, to give them a 15% rebate. With the intent is the hope that they'll use that money to hire and reinvest it into the business. The government's also planning to basically reduce the corporate taxes from 11 to 9% over a period of next 4 years. So they'll gradually phase it out, so it might be 1% in 2 years and 1% in the following 2 years. So just to basically help support small business to keep more of that income. It's also looking at keeping the accelerated CCA for manufacturing equipment. Okay, that one was basically temporary, but they're making it more permanent for the next 10 years. And there's a few other things they're talking about, red tape and different regulations. These are the commitments that Stephen Harper's done, likely from talking to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses as part of the budget committee meetings to basically go through what some of the requirements and to support expansion. And you won't hear these conversations done by the opposition that Harper's actually made commitments on small business, because again, the NDP can't win, or the Liberal Party can't win basically talking about policies that are in play or that what Harper's done in terms of having success. They have to make him look like the devil or the evil twin. So let's talk about the NDP. The NDP likes to talk about they're the champion for small business. Okay, what they don't tell you is that basically Harper's already looking at a cut to corporate taxes for small business. Okay, he doesn't. Thomas Mulcair doesn't mention that. He just mentions that he's going to cut it, but he doesn't say when he's going to cut it. Right? Is he going to gradually phase it in, or what is he going to do there? The other thing that he doesn't mention as well is the NDP is looking at a cap and trade system, which is basically looking at carbon tax, carbon pricing. Now, we already talked about red tape. Well, if you're bringing in carbon pricing, cap, trade, you're actually adding more regulation to business, and that actually might end up impacting small businesses because they may have to report on that, the carbon pricing and different rules and that. The other thing the NDP is looking at is more environmental standards or stringent rules, right? Well, again, that's going to impact on the ability of small business to basically navigate those new regulations. So he's not improving red tape, he's actually increasing it. He's making it more difficult for small business. The other thing that he's bringing into as well is he's a big supporter of CPP enhancement, which is a payroll tax. So that's a dollar for dollar match. So if he increases it by 4%, that's going to increase cost of business. But he doesn't mention that in his discussion with small business, because I guess what he believes is that by cutting the corporate taxes, the other money in that, they'll still be better off to redeploy it, right? But he doesn't talk about that. The other thing he doesn't talk about as well, Thomas Mulcair, is that Stephen Harper has redefined the grants and business loans to allow better access to capital for business. That's not even discussed by Thomas Mulcair. He doesn't even look at that. So he basically is so narrow focused in terms of his policies that basically he just picks and chooses what he wants to see to kind of play into that market. But yet, basically, if you look at what we drived earlier about some of the factors that drive business, he's not even identifying or even fixing the key areas that business has a concern with. The Liberal Party now, basically, in general, has said nothing about the corporate taxes. So I'm going to assume right now, based on some of the statements by Justin Trudeau, is that he's going to keep Harper's plan to reduce the corporate taxes. That's fine. So he supports Harper on corporate taxes. What he doesn't do and doesn't mention that Justin Trudeau also promotes CP enhancement, which is a payroll tax. So that's not mentioned. And JT, or Justin Trudeau, also mentioned that he's actually going to implement, too, as well, he's going to implement basically a cap and trade system. So he's going to add a carbon pricing, just like Thomas Mulcair, which means more red tape. So we're seeing right away a pattern with the NDP and both the Liberal Party is they're not really thinking a holistic view of the small business. They're looking at basically one or two policies, and then they're basically going to push the rest of the policies down without really consulting the understanding that these are not what business want. Now let's look at what Stephen Harper has done. Stephen Harper has brought the GST down to 7 to 5%. He's a planned cut for 15% in 2017 targeted at small business. He's reducing the corporate tax from 11% down to 9%. And he's looking at controlling growth in CPP and EI payments overall to make sure that they're not out of line. So he wants to make sure that they're growing, that maybe they grow at the cost of inflation. Okay? And he will continue to focus on red tape because he knows that small business does not want to be hindered by more and more red tape. And just recently in his scorecard, he is rated B, got a B rating for his red tape reduction. So he's making significant steps. He's the only one that seems to be addressing and understanding requirements of business. As much as the NDP say that he's not, he seems to be responding to that. That you're never going to get a clear indication from from Thomas Mulcair or Justin Trudeau. Why? Because first of all, neither one of them ever came from a business background that really understands the pressure of competing. Justin Trudeau came from a rich upbringing. What does he know about competing for a small business? He doesn't know anything. Thomas Mulcair was a former environmental minister, spent most of his time in the public sector. So what's he know about what's it take to compete as a business? He doesn't know anything. Stephen Harper rised up through Petro-Canada. His father was an accountant. So he kind of understands what the pressure points of business are. Okay? And he's also an economist by trade. So I would have put more substance to what the actions of Stephen Harper is versus Mulcair or basically Justin Trudeau based on their background. Now, let's talk about CFIB. This is the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Now, again, a lot of people will look at this and say, you know what? They're an independent body. Okay, they're propaganda for the Conservative Party of Canada. Are they? They act on behalf of their constituents. Okay, no different than the NDP is acting on their constituents, which is union, like Unifor. No different than Justin Trudeau, who's acting on behalf of his constituents, which is being driven by green power, green energy. So each one of them is kind of looking at their perspective in terms of protecting their territory. Now, since each one of these parties, from the Liberal Party to the NDP to the Conservatives, have put a key platform and discussion about small business, it only makes sense that we talk about the main issues here. And on this screen you're seeing pensions and retirement. Okay, well, basically CFIB's Canadian Federation of Independent Business, they don't want to see any more hikes to payroll taxes. They don't want it. They can't afford it. So we already know the Liberal Party and the NDP supports payroll and taxes enhancements. Okay, the other thing that you're going to see here is, well, it's taxes in general. Okay, basically there is a couple things the NDP's talked about, but they haven't been clear. They're talking about a job tax credit, right, for hiring. Now, they haven't been clear on how that will be implemented, right, and what the cost of that. So that's one thing I will say with the NDP. They are looking a little bit on the EI reforms, but what you take from one hand and hike in the carbon tax or the EI, are you not offsetting some of this stuff? And so is the business really benefiting from that? Okay, so you're seeing right there basically the commitment. And as I said, everybody seems to be okay with the corporate tax cut, but it's the other payroll taxes and the other commitments of cost for business that you're not getting clear message from the Liberal Party or the NDP. Red tape reduction. Well, the government wants, the Canadian Federation of Independent wants to make sure that they're not spending all this time filing government forms. They want to streamline the process. Well, we know with Stephen Harper that's his goal. The NDP and the Liberal Party, by changing any environmental rules or any other policies, they're actually pushing more red tape down there. But that's not clear from when you're going to get that message from either the Liberal Party or the NDP. They're basically going to say we're championing small business. Are they? If they're not looking at all angles of policy, are they really championing? And the answer is probably not. Okay. Now, we're also going to talk about internal trade agreements. Now, the biggest pain point right now is commerce between provinces right now. Now, a lot of that falls under the jurisdiction of the provinces, but most cases there's been a stumbling block with provinces like Ontario, where Kathleen Wynne fights transfers because she wants to protect her turf here, which is the union support that basically gets her elected. So we're basically going to have walls. Both Mulcair and Justin Trudeau talk about more relationship with the provinces, but it won't change that relationship if provinces aren't willing to break down those walls. So that's one of the areas they're talking about. Okay. The other area that I want to talk about now is labor shortages. Right? We talked about skills there. Now, they want to make sure that they have access to labor, whether that means that the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, which has been revised under Harper, they can utilize that program, or they can have access to different apprenticeship or skill set programs. Okay, so that's why they're talking about training tax credits or looking at different things to kind of look at ways to update the skill sets. Now, the other thing that you don't hear talk about, and this is another pain point for Canadian Federation of Independent Business, is government spending. Now, Stephen Harper has focused on the size of government and keeping expenses down, just the overall size, and basically looked at different ways to operate government where it made more sense. What you're going to hear with the NDP, if you're going to bring in carbon trade or other aspects of spending, you may be looking at they're going to bump up the payroll costs within government. I've never seen an NDP or Liberal government not add staff. Now, with the exception of maybe Paul Martin and John Chrétien in the 90s, typically provincial governments and both NDP and Liberal have added staff, because this comes up to a key point here for business. Now you're starting to see a huge gap between private and public sector wages. Okay, the only one that seems to be thinking that's a big concern is the Conservative Party, and they've been dealing with that. It doesn't fix the provincial issues, but if you've really got concerns about things, you need to be looking at the whole gamut of how government's paid here. If I'm a businessman, private sector, I want government to live within its means. And Stephen Harper has tried to push down, and he's got program spending in terms of the lowest level as percentage of GDP. So he's really focused on getting bang for your buck. when we look at typically with the NDP, and a good example of it's Manitoba. Manitoba's had a downgraded rating because they don't seem to have their expenses under control. They've got the worst healthcare system in Canada. They've got a D rating, and they're an NDP government. So Mulcair seems to think that basically he can champion all these things and keep costs down, but there's no track record in the last 10 years the NDP actually can do that. Justin Trudeau is actually going to come out and say the same thing, but he keeps talking about income inequality. But what he doesn't talk about is the gap between private and public sector payrolls. And unless we correct that or fix that, these costs to government is going to continue to rise. Now, what I wanted to do with this particular slide now is show you basically a trend here on a table. So basically I've listed the policy, okay? CPP enhancement. The NDP, Liberal Party support it. Conservative Party of Canada does not. Basically they're saying through the tax-free savings accounts, through pooling plans they support RSPs, there's not enough options available for people to save money. They don't believe adding more payroll taxes because they believe it's a job killer. Yet the NDP and Liberal Canada support CPP enhancements. The only way you can get an enhancement in CPP is if you increase payroll taxes. Taxation. The NDP is not clear. They're clear that they're going to reduce the corporate tax down to 9%. Not clear what interval of time that they're going to do that in. The other thing too is it's not clear on the job tax credit or how they're actually going to flow through some of the EI reforms or how they're going to manage the EI costs for business. The Liberal Party of Canada hasn't committed on anything on the corporate taxes, but let's assume that they keep it. What they also want to bring in is an EI holiday. Now, here's the issue with it. If I'm not collecting EI on people, I'm going to put a lot of pressure on that EI fund to be sustainable. And we've seen in the 90s what the Liberal Party likes to do with the EI funds. They like to take money from it. So they may end up changing some of the rules around to that to make sure that they can use the funds to that. And they've got a track record where they've taken money from EI. The Conservatives have agreed to reduce it down to 9%, the corporate tax rate, over a period of 4 years. They also agreed to have a targeted 15% reduction in EI to qualified businesses. So usually they're going to target businesses 1 to 10. Okay? And they're basically going to focus on. Now, what you're going to hear there is that, and here's the angling that you're going to hear from the NDP and the Liberal Party on there. You're going to hear a conversation about the Parliament Budget Officer, which is the PBO office, basically discuss, basically saying that they don't believe it'll create any jobs. Well, that's their perspective with their assumptions. Okay, they ran something through their model, and they made the assumption that once you got above 10 employees that you won't hire or expand your business to take a benefit of the 15% EI cut. However, that's one perspective. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business supports that because they believe that it will help business that incur cash that's required to expand their business. Who am I going to trust? That the verdict's on you. I would probably put more substance in the Canadian Federation of Independent Business because they're talking to their constituents. These are the guys that are going to hire people. Parliamentary Budget Officer is not hiring people. He's making assumptions based on whatever data and assertions he has. How reliable is it? Well, he's not hiring. So what did he ask or survey people? Those are the questions you need to ask of the validity of certain statements. Okay? Red tape. The Conservatives have a plan to reduce red tape. I already mentioned earlier, the Liberals and the NDP are looking at cap and trade systems or other policies that may force up red tape, which may make it more difficult for small business. Skilled trades. We talked a bit about this. Okay, the NDP's stance now, before their platform has been released, is they'll work with unions. Well, we've already seen what happens when you start working with unions. They'll start dictating their own policies and all that don't necessarily benefit a wide range of skill sets, right? And we've seen that already in Ontario where they tried to bring in the College of Trades, and it's actually hurt the development skilled trades. It hasn't really expanded it, and we need to kind of look at streamlining processes. The Liberal Party has also made the same statement they'll work with unions. They haven't been clear on what their training plans is. The Conservative Party of Canada has basically said we'll look at loans and grants programs to support people entering the trades. They really want to push it. Okay? We talked about government size. Both the Liberal Party and the NDP are not clear on what they would do with the size of the public sector. We can guarantee that by their statements that they would probably expand it. Okay, so they're going to add more cost. Okay, but it's not clear on that. The Conservative Party of Canada is looking at the right size of government, looking where functions should be sourced. For example, they signed deals with IBM to better manage the sciences by looking at analytics. Do you ever hear the Liberal Party of Canada or the NDP talk about analytics? No, because they don't believe in that stuff. They believe that you need to have a man person doing that. But sciences have changed. We've got more technology in place that the private sector can likely do a better analysis of policy. So we need to basically keep that in consideration. So that's why basically we want to make sure we understand that. In summary, the only party that I've seen from my analysis, and of course people are going to say I'm biased, and maybe I am, but I look at things in a perspective. If I want a government that's going to support my business, the only one I see that supports my business and has got a track record of doing the right policies is the Conservative Party of Canada. This concludes my presentation.